without any further ado, I'm going to start with the presentation. So I'm going to talk to you around your style pedagogy today. So just about bit about myself. So I'm a senior lecturer in economics at De Montfort. I'm also a deputy director on the learning and teaching strand for the Doctor of Business Administration program. So I teach a number of professionals on different programs as well. So the basic idea is I'm trying to develop myself as a learning and teaching specialist, looking at varied pedagogies, why we use them, and what is the importance of having a different approaches and not getting absorbed with a standard practices. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to speak around a few exemplar approaches and identify how they interact and intersect with our routine thinking, and how could we absorb them to have more effective methods of depicting especially our uniqueness. And that's the reason why the title Your Style Pedagogy. So basically I'd want you to focus throughout in finding the approaches that identify you as a specialist teacher, or finding your USP. And sometimes you also say that what is your uniqueness towards when it comes to teaching, which is your unique style of teaching. So uh, often a day's Twitter feed, social media appears. There are a number of, there's no dearth of innovative approaches. So we often go into our social media pages, LinkedIn, Twitter in the evening, and see so many approaches being done across the higher education sector. I feel I should have added Elon Musk to this, because despite not being on my friend list, he does appear a lot. I don't know why that happens, but perhaps has reduced in frequency nowadays. So you have people doing using pop culture to teach, especially in my area in microeconomics. And then you have someone using ice creams to and letting students identify which brand is it. By the way, that would have been an interesting class to attend. Then you have podcasts, use of VWalks. We just heard something around the voting technology in a previous presentation. And then you also nowadays have more stress around playful or creative learning and teaching. So I often feel that looking at all these examples, though they're fantastic, but sometimes my day becomes overwhelming thinking, how do I find time to adapt or bring in new innovative approaches into my day-to-day routine? I'm sure we all have a very long to-do list that makes us sometimes do the most urgent tasks and leaving sometimes the most interesting ones behind. So how do we identify which technique we should adopt, and how do we find time to look at that technique? Now, over time, I've found answers to these questions by passionately following what I enjoy doing the most. I mean, so my stress always is on the fact that I want to identify myself as a specialist educator and work on those strengths and uniqueness. Obviously, over time, the specialism could change because I could have achieved a particular standard or a benchmark. So, what I want you to identify throughout the presentation is what is your uniqueness, and what is your unique style? What is your style of teaching? So, imagine you could teach in any way, but definitely do not overrun the regulations or administrative procedures. So, I'm not here to ask you to destruct curriculum. But if you could just imagine that you could teach in any way, what different strategies would you use? How similar or how different your teaching would be? Would you be able to think outside the box and not be absorbed by standard practices? By the way, I do personally feel that this type of, reflecting on your teaching style also allows us to sometimes understand more closely as to how our students learn and what is the purpose of our subject. So it opens a useful window where you can reflect on different approaches, where you can actually reflect on your uniqueness and your style in terms of teaching and learning. So what I'll do today is, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to run through a number of approaches. I won't present a particular example and show the results or outcomes in terms of student performances, But I will run through a couple of approaches and look at what are the different pros and cons, what are the do's and don'ts that we should keep in mind when it comes to the different learning and teaching strategies. But before that, why is it important to understand what our uniqueness is? Why is it important to reflect on different teaching and learning strategies? I mean, first of all, we are returning back to the normal. So more than ever, we've seen we've had a taste of online teaching. We've had a taste of a bundle of resources being developed and shared across the higher education. We've had a community of practices being formed, such as the one we are currently sitting in. So, but the landscape obviously has changed. So, a dearth of new resources, new collaborations, new community of practices have been formed. So it is perhaps the time when we start looking at the different practical resources that have been created, what are the different innovative pedagogies we have, and focus on some of the challenges that we might have faced across those different approaches and strategies throughout the pandemic period, and then identify which are our tools that we would want to use. How do we develop a culture that looks into teaching in our own styled way? So, in terms of the more concrete objectives, I'm going to discuss three key ones. The first one being active learning. Now, these are not new terms that you would be looking at. I'm sure everyone's heard of active learning, everyone's heard of community engagement. So, I'll go one at a time in terms of how I identify, or when I look at active learning and when I try to see whether I'm active, whether it's active learning is one of my uniquenesses. So how do I identify the do's and don'ts, or what are the strategies that I use? So when I'm going through these different types and different teaching styles, I'd want you to reflect on your practice and see whether which is the strand where you think you fit the most perfectly, or where you'd like to fit. Where is your passion in terms of these different teaching and learning strategies? So I'm still hoping I'm clearly audible to everyone. If that's a yes, and there's no further technological glitch that happened in between. Anshul, if you could just give me a nod, please.
Yes, it's working, and we all can hear
Okay,
you.
perfect. Thank you. Okay, so the first one that I thought I'd put together was active learning. So, especially active learning is also sometimes an exemplification of inclusivity. So, more than just the idea that one size fits all, when we look at active learning, we try to bring our learners together and work around their sort of interests, needs, and curiosity. So it tries to identify your learner's needs and match that with the resource and content. So if you're one of those who think that you can involve your learners by helping and make them autonomous learners, basically, so or you can, that you'd like to see the way they when the learners interact with the content and see how the results or outcomes work. So basically asking learners to become more involved through thinking and creating. So it's more like a conscious learning environment that emerges from activity, and also based around the philosophy that learning comes when you're actively involved in a process. So active learning could take different shapes and forms, and I'm sure we all do these kind of activities more or less. Especially something like a flipped classroom has become very, very popular given the interesting videos the asynchronous videos we created throughout pandemic. So a couple of examples in terms of active learning, which is involving your learners into constructing and reconstructing knowledge, is could be in class activities, could be role play, could be problem solving. Something like a 1 minute paper, where when I say 1 minute paper, it often means that you ask your learners, towards the end of the session, you ask your students to identify one thing that they learned today, one best concept, or one of the most favorite concepts, or anything, like a 1 minute thought and reflection around the session. um, Even icebreaker activities come as part of active learning. So you could be really, really interested in designing something that would allow students to break the ice in the first week when they come, especially for sometimes the level 6 students or the second year students who've not had face-to-face teaching in their first years, but now they're back to campus after pandemic. So any sort of classroom experiments, simulations come as examples of active learning. But when you're looking at active learning, one of the major concerns that comes across is unpredictability. So when I say unpredictability, even though we are trying to engage our students, but it is quite possible that the student refuses to engage. So it is actually a situation wherein you would want to know some answers from the students, but the students are not replying back. And this is quite common. Also, another thing about active learning is it's why it's unpredictable is because sometimes the students could question your role. I mean, because active learning often makes your role quite passive in a situation. So are you actually teaching? Are you actually interacting with your students? Or is it most of the work being done in within the classroom by the students or by the learners? And often it's also unpredictable because of the fact that you could lose control of the activity. So you've given an icebreaker problem, or you've given a role play situation, and students tend to interact with one another. So what happens to your role? Do you lose control, and does it fit into a large group? Because sometimes active learning, the proponents could say it works much better when you have a smaller group or when you have a seminar session rather than a lecture session. So those are the kind of unpredictability that gets associated with active learning. And when I look at active learning as one of the teaching and learning strategies, and if I want to identify my strength here, I'd work on these do's and don'ts. So first of all, I'd always think is that there is a need to constantly adjust my session. I may go in with a particular plan, but then that plan may not work completely. I'll have to adjust it to incorporate the students' reactions, to incorporate the class strength, how many students turn up on that day. So adjusting the session is really really important if I'm looking at active learning as one of my styles. The other thing is that I have to be watchful, I have to be alert, I have to intervene. So I cannot just be very, very passive. So something that stems from the unpredictability that if you are using active learning, if you delving into a number of activities in your session, then you have to be very, very alert. You have to intervene in the session. Do not make assumptions. So there are definitely and always some of the students who are reluctant to interact. You can try as much, but they would not interact during a particular situation, or during role plays, or during even an icebreaker activity. So you just ask, tell me about yourself. Even then, they would just give you their name. That's all. So do not go in with any assumption. So you could have a situation where an activity could completely falsify, or it could completely fall flat on the face. So have a strategy, have a clear rationale. I mean, this particular due, I'd say, has been really useful for me in the past, because I always tell my students that why we are doing something. And I think that's really, really important to build that sort of confidence and rapport with the students. So have a clear strategy and rationale when you're choosing a particular activity. And do not ignore a particular type of group. So often we could just stand and get stuck with a group of students who are interacting a lot, whereas I mean unconsciously ignore a group of students who are not talking at all. So this is one of the don'ts that we should always remember. And most importantly, I'd say do not ignore the outcomes of the activity. So if you're really looking forward to identifying your style as an active learning style, then please ensure that you keep in mind that whatever the outcomes of the activities are, that are shared with students. So maybe through a Padlet wall, collect feedback, talk to your students that this is what we did in the last class, and this is how we're going to use the outcomes of that or results of that for the next session. So anything around active learning has to have these do's and don'ts, I think, to make that session really really successful. The second sort of strand that I wanted to talk around today is community engagement and group work. So I often also sometimes refer to this approach as a flexible approach, because this is sometimes we confuse that isn't a group work or a group activity would be something very closely related to active learning type. So for instance, if I say flipped classroom, yes, that could be identified in both strands. But group work or community engagement is not just about flipping, it's also about flexing. So especially because of the number of tools and technology available nowadays. So why do we want to compartmentalize our teaching and learning? Why can't we just open up, use the tools, and equip our students to become independent learners? And that would also complement face-to-face teaching. So if you're one of those who would like to promote anytime learning, add more flexibility to your teaching through discussion forums, through group works, through webinars, through even podcasting, which is kind of becoming very, very popular nowadays. And you are one of those social and constructivist thinker who'd suggest that it helps to form community of practice where learning takes place through social interaction and can encourage group work among students, then this type of style could be for you. So, because group work or community engagement would not only allow you to connect with your students, and or vice versa, students to connect with you, but also with your content and the peers. So community engagement and group work is very, very essential when it comes to constructivist sort of approach, where you allow learning by social interaction, so and connection to be built not just with the teacher but with the content and the peers. But again, there's a cautious warning that anxiety is a really big issue when it comes to community engagement and group work. I personally have had students who'd come to me and suggest that they are really shy to come to the class, let alone be in a group and talk to their peers. So, how do we ensure that everyone in the group or within the classroom is so supportive that positive relationships could be formed? So, for that, I feel a scaffolded approach or skills are needed. So, first of all, whenever you have a group work or whenever you are delving into a group activity, try creating a video explaining the brief, right? So, tell the students again why are we doing a particular task? What does the task entail? So, very crisp video that explains the task when it comes to group activity. Also, often the anxiety comes from the fact that it's an assessed piece. So I could be a really good student and cautious about how are the others in my group. Would my mark be disturbed because of non-engagement by someone else, or would everyone reply to my emails? I mean, that sort of a thing is always there. So try building a sort of a non-assessed initial task where students just get the flavor of how the end result would be, and give sort of feedback around that particular task to the students. Could there be an arrangement for working together? So could you encourage your students to suggest and try and involve you into their conversations, so that if there is a sort of non-engagement, you could come in and consider why the non-engagement is happening. So sort of a culture of openness to explore that sort of non-engagement, and kind of a protocol of working together. So, in terms of the tools, when I pick group tasks or community engagement as one of the styles that I'd like to develop my expertise around, I kind of go with a few tools with me. So, first of all, an agenda for group meetings. Now, I'm not saying you add this as a task to your workload where you have an agenda that you have to take box and exercise every time the students meet, but maybe give them this agenda that every time they meet they have to distribute tasks among themselves, or every time they meet they have to report back to the group that this is what they've done. So kind of an agenda that's their choice to take on board or not. Then there could be targets to achieve. So every time you could give them, you could set up in the beginning of the assessment or the group activity that at the end of the first week, this, your group should have achieved this particular target. So, and the other one could be mapping aims and objectives. So, where you have, again, you have to achieve this objective by the end of first week, you have to achieve another objective by the end of second week. So I just am trying to say that when you have a group activity, or when you're trying to build a community engagement among students, or a learning network among students, they like to have some sort of concrete targets, achievable targets with them, so that a sort of arrangement of working together, or a protocol of working together, could be developed. And the last point, which I was very keen to talk, because is participation points. Often group activities enhanced through gamification or through assigning points, and points could mean marks. So you could have a coursework where, if the students, let's say, attain a max of 100 points, those 100 points could mean 5 marks for that particular group. So see the engagement through interaction with you, through interaction with their peers, how the group is progressing. At that time during the classes, you can have a glimpse of their agendas, you can have a glimpse of how they're achieving the different targets, and award them points, which could then mean marks. So the last one basically is playful learning, and this is quite interesting, because I personally feel I'm an AFOL, which means an adult fan of Lego. So playful learning comes in different forms, but Lego Serious Play is more recent. It has its own form, and it's becoming quite popular. And the reason is that initially, Lego Serious Play was created to focus within the business and management or leadership context, but it has the capability to cross those boundaries and subject areas. So, Lego Serious Play is not just about building literal models, but a metaphorical representation to problems and solutions. So, idea around this one is, so if you identify yourself as an adult who believes in play, and who believes that play could add to adult learning, then this is a strand for you to explore, because you are definitely thinking in terms of dexterity, you are definitely thinking in terms of a three-legged stool, where the three legs are head, heart, and hands. And you want to promote creative thinking and finding problems. So basically, Lego Serious Play allows the students to become more self-aware of a problem, of a solution. It allows them to be more creative when it comes to finding the solutions. So as I was saying, that Lego Serious Play has the potential to cross boundaries. This is something that I tried my financial market students. I had never imagined that economics, often termed as a dry subject, but could be so interesting to use Lego Serious Play. So they were given a problem around identifying the core principles of money and banking, and they're trying to identify it through Lego. Now, the first piece, I just want to focus on the first one, is often it's difficult to engage the students in the very first go. So let them explore the pieces, let them explore different pieces. So that particular student has literally put down every piece in a single way, because they were not aware of how to give a start. So let them, in the first few weeks, let them explore, give them the task, tell them why they're doing Lego Serious Play. So the initial push could be required, but must explain the purpose behind it. Again, one more cautious thing, if you're trying to develop your strength here, is no generalization or stereotyping. So students could have their own interpretations. And most importantly, correct facilitation is really, really important. So I'm just going to take another 30 seconds, because I just wanted to leave on this particular note, and something that stemmed from my technology, what I've just faced with the technology, my problem with the technology in a couple of minutes ago, is do not use a tech or a tool just for the sake of it. So don't make it a gimmick. Try including the pedagogic relevance of that tool. So try asking questions around, can you explain the relevance pedagogically? Can you justify the tool? So whether you're doing flipped classroom, using lecture capture, or whether you're using any sort of tool for community engagement, whether you're doing a sort of gamification stuff. So anything that you do, please do ensure that you have a pedagogical relevance.